Hello and welcome to Pemberley and Beyond. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a book that took me to places that I wouldn't normally go and made me feel things almost in spite of myself. Let the blurb music roll, for it is time to read the back cover, which I didn't even glance at before I started reading this book, which will become an important detail later on. Charlotte Lucas has never been a romantic. Practical to a fault, she accepted Mr. Collins's proposal with clear eyes and a steady heart, trading passion for security. Life at Hunsford Parsonage may be quiet and predictable, but it is hers to manage, and she's determined to make the best of it, whatever her friend Elizabeth Bennet may think. That is, until an unexpected guest at nearby Rosings Park turns Charlotte's careful world on its head. He sees her, challenges her, and a spark is lit. But true contentment is not only about who you choose to love, but who you choose to be. For the first time, she wonders, has playing by the rules kept her on the sidelines of her own life? Before I delve into my top 3 tropes from this novel, I'm going to take a moment to contextualize this book. It's written by Rachel Parris, who was one of the founders of Austentatious, which was like the improv comedy show that riffed on Austen's works. Every show, they let the audience come up with potential Austen-esque titles for that night's play. I was lucky enough to see it once, and it was electrifyingly good. All the actors had a brilliant knowledge of Austen's work. I'm talking even the minor characters. I cannot for the life of me remember what the title of that evening's play was, but I do remember laughing so hard that my sides ached. So, naturally, when I saw that Rachel Parris had written a novel about Mrs. Collins, I was absolutely psyched to read it. There have been so many readings, like interpretations, of Charlotte's sexuality based on her infamous speech to Lizzie Bennet, which I will now quote. "I'm not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." This leads us squarely to the first trope that I want to cover today, the practical or forced marriage trope. Like many young women, when I first read Pride and Prejudice as a teenager, I was inclined to side with Elizabeth Bennet, who felt that Charlotte had sold herself short in accepting Mr. Collins's proposal, and that it would be impossible for Charlotte to be even tolerably happy as Mr. Collins' wife. But as I've got older, I've come to not only understand Charlotte's position, but also respect her for being able to make that choice when she was between Scylla and Charybdis. Shortly after Charlotte's acceptance of Mr. Collins's proposal, we're told that Charlotte's brothers were already rather apprehensive about Charlotte dying an old maid, and surely, though this bit isn't mentioned in as many words, about how they were going to support her over the years. As was shown in some of Austen's other works, being an unmarried lady could be incredibly difficult. Take, for example, Miss Bates in Emma. She's genteel but poor, and is an object of charity, pity, and general punching down upon throughout the novel. When Emma is rude to her at that absolute disaster of a picnic at Box Hill, Mr. Knightley reproaches Emma by saying that Miss Bates has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to an old age must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. That's right, Miss Bates always needed to be treated, or should have been treated, with kid gloves on because of her station in life, and it's not too hard to imagine how Charlotte Lucas, in a parallel universe, could have also slowly sunk from those comforts she was born to, and ended up being treated with that same mixture of absolutely damning pity by Lizzie and by all those in her life around her. So when Charlotte chooses to marry Mr. Collins, we understand the logic that propels her towards that choice. And the forced marriage trope really shapes the novel. I thought that it was going to be explored in a slightly different way than it was, as I will mention when I talk about the second trope, because they do feed into one another. But just to contextualize it, the practical or forced marriage trope did add a lot of tension to the second and, for me, the most shocking of the tropes in this novel, which is the forbidden romance. Now, I do not know about you, but when I cast my mind back over the books I've read in the last 10 years or so, I've become used to the forbidden romance trope popping up in fantasy or romantasy novels and being presented in a very come hither way. Like, she's a human assassin and he's a fae prince. My, doesn't this romance defy convention? And in case you get that reference, to be clear, I don't have anything against ACOTAR. I've found the ways that Sarah J. Maas has transformed the new adult romance genre to be rather daringly feminist. I think overall it's a net positive to the romance genre. And that is in part because the two works of hers that I've read have gently taken the female-led romance genre from the cult of purity that Twilight and 50 Shades espoused, and into the currently very contemporary and still underrepresented world of informed and positive consent. But that said, possibly because I'm from Southeast England, a part of the world where relationships between people with different ethnic origins are the norm, I tend to read the tensions in forbidden romances between humanoid species portrayed in, Maas's romantasy novels as a kind of cipher for North American explorations of interracial romances. And as a result, I tend to find them pretty low stakes and not as shocking as they seem intended to be. However, in introducing Mrs. Collins, the forbidden romance trope actually shocked me. Like, I had to physically put the book down and think about how I felt about what I was reading, which was fantastic. As I've said previously, being challenged by Jane Austen-inspired fiction is one of the things that keeps the genre so fresh and keeps me coming back for more. Now, full disclosure, there are going to be some spoilers here on out. If you would like to skip ahead to this episode's book recommendation, you can find the timestamp for it below in the episode description. Now, for those of you who haven't skipped ahead, as I've mentioned a few minutes ago, introducing Mrs. Collins starts off with Charlotte Lucas marrying Mr. Collins for incredibly practical reasons. And as I didn't read the blurb, I went into this book thinking that this was going to be a quietly understated novel about either Charlotte Collins coming into her own as Mr. Collins' wife, and the two of them growing to love one another and form a rather sweet couple, or I thought it might come up from a point shortly after their marriage where Mr. Collins dies and Charlotte, again, comes into her own and finds her footing in society as a widow. Those are both fairly common storylines in the Charlotte Lucas retelling world, and I wholeheartedly enjoy them. Instead, I was plunged into one of the Charlotte Lucas storylines that my brain usually edits out, and that's the one in which Charlotte has, spoiler, an extramarital affair. There, I've said it. Are you as shocked as I was? Because even now that trope sits rather uneasily with me. Now, as far as I remember, the last time I read a novel where Charlotte ends up having an affair was back in 2020 when I read the eponymous Charlotte by Helen Moffat. Now, on paper, there are similar elements in the portrayal of this forbidden romance. There was a sex scene that was somewhat graphic. There's a sense of relief on Charlotte's side at finding someone who is an emotional and sexual equal. And there is this kind of unlocking of her feelings and desires that she's not even realized that she's held by a character who, as I've said, is her equal and who challenges her for the first time in her entire dating life, we assume. And I know I've said that this trope sits rather uneasily with me, and I've spent quite a bit of time unpacking what causes that. And I think that my issue with the infidelity trope is because I'm coming to it with my modern day perspective. And this can be something of a problem because the theme of infidelity is a super common trope that pops up all the time in modern day Regency romance novels. I mean, how often does part of a plot revolve around a rake who keeps mistresses, but then reforms, stops keeping them, and becomes wholeheartedly monogamous when he meets the woman he ends up marrying? But in reality, I know that the opposite was historically true. After a man had fulfilled his duty in marriage by siring the requisite number of heirs, he'd wander off and sow his oats elsewhere. And in quite a few cases, he didn't even need to have sired an heir in order to go and have a lot of extramarital affairs. Just look at Lord Byron. I mean, case in point. But similarly, women who were trapped in loveless marriages would go off and have affairs with other men. And after all, when you're forced to marry in order to secure a home for your old age, you're not exactly being driven into your future husband's arms by fiery loins. That was a little tangent, but I felt that overall this forbidden romance / infidelity trope, it was humorously and sensitively explored. We got the whole build-up of how Charlotte's continued to feel overlooked and undervalued in favour of Lizzie, especially, as a lot of the action is kick-started by Lizzie's coming over to visit Charlotte when she's newly married, and in that whole time when Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam turn up. And I don't know how familiar you are with the 1995 version, but in that you really see how everyone is paying attention to Lizzie. Lady Catherine is showing her a lot of favour because they keep getting invited back to Rosings Park to dine, and she's playing the piano. She's having a fantastic time, and she's surrounded by these attractive men who, I mean, Darcy is still not really doing that much apart from, creating a lot of drama that then becomes plot points for later on. But Colonel Fitzwilliam is definitely a little interested, even though he obviously cannot be with her because I'm sure he wants to marry a true heiress. So when after this fantastic build-up, Charlotte finally meets someone who notices her, values her, appreciates her company, and who she converses with as an equal, you sense her relief, and more than relief, it's her joy at finally being recognised as her own person, and an interesting person at that. But I don't think that I would have received the forbidden romance trope as well as I did had it not been for the third and final trope that I'm going to mention in this episode, which is the love triangle. Controversial as it may sound, in introducing Mrs. Collins, both the men who love Charlotte, that's Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Collins, offer more than the standard hot male main love interest and less attractive male love interest options. I leave it to you, gentle listener, to work out who is who from that description. But the love triangle here serves to explore the two equally compelling pillars of Charlotte's duty and burgeoning desire. And ultimately, I found it was how this terrain was explored by Rachel Parris that made me appreciate the nuances of the forbidden romance trope. So, addressing the elephant in the room, it is hard to make Mr. Collins seem like an attractive option in his own right, especially when the author has kept his character as close as possible to the one written by Austen. I do not envy Rachel Parris that task, but she approached it with darn good spirit. For starters, there were a couple of flashback scenes where we learn more about Mr. Collins' younger years. I thought they were delicately done. They allowed me to feel a degree of sympathy for the foolish, pretentious character we are encouraged to laugh at in Pride and Prejudice. In introducing Mrs. Collins, he is still as foolish and bumbling as in the original novel. However, he has his moments, and those moments range from toe-curlingly awkward sex, which, look, it was hilarious and in keeping with his character, but the only way I can describe it without any spoilering is if you've seen any of the Austentatious productions, just see it as extentatious instead. Humorous and too much detail. It's the only way I can describe it. But she takes it from these ridiculous scenes to the absolute sublime. And one of the most poignant moments in the whole novel that stuck with me is when Mr. Collins is looking at Charlotte when she's just being herself, radiant without realizing it, at a social gathering, and he just thinks to himself, she is beyond me. And that just hit me really hard in the feels, because there's nothing cruel, there's nothing calculated, there's nothing jealous. It was just quite a sad, poignant moment. And I think that really sums up the exposition of Mr. Collins' character in the novel. I ended up feeling that not only could Charlotte have had a good life with him beyond just standard material comfort, but I also felt that Mr. Collins didn't feel like a really poor second choice compared to the rather dashing Colonel Fitzwilliam. And I know that I'm not going into much detail about the other side of the love triangle between Colonel Fitzwilliam and Charlotte Collins, but I feel that that's because a love triangle is only as strong as its weakest element, and I don't think that your average Jane Austen fan is going to say, oh, Mr. Collins, what a dude. You know, it's just not going to happen. So I was utterly thrilled by the way that Rachel Parris created that love triangle and really strengthened, as I've said, the weakest side of it. And that sums up my 3 tropes for the episode, which means it is now time for the Hocus Tropus. In case you're new here, every episode I take one prominent trope from the main fanfiction book and recommend a second novel. One not set in the Austen verse that contains the same trope but done differently. And this episode's trope is the love triangle. Now, before you groan and switch off, don't worry, even though I mentioned both Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey earlier, I am not going to recommend either of them. Now, as Introducing Mrs. Collins shows, there are some wonderfully nuanced ways of bringing in tropes. In honour of that nuance, the book I've chosen is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyenken Braithwaite, and apologies if I have mispronounced the name. Like Introducing Mrs. Collins, My Sister the Serial Killer has the sort of love triangle that you don't usually see showcased in literature. As the title hints, the main character's sister, Ayula, is a rare breed, a female serial killer. Hooray for women in male-dominated fields and all that. At the start of the novel, it's revealed that Ayula has killed 3 of her ex-boyfriends in self-defense. Each time, our main character, Corede, has helped to quite literally clean up after her sister has carried out her gruesome deeds. She's disposed of the bodies, cleaned up the crime scenes, given alibis. All around, she has supported her sister. But what's going to happen when Ayula starts dating Corede's work crush, a handsome doctor? This love triangle examines pretty privilege, the long-term impact of growing up in a home with domestic violence, and the time-honoured expression, blood is thicker than water. It is an absolutely corking read, a Booker Prize longlist nominee, and a fantastic play on the love triangle trope. And that wraps up this episode's Hocus Tropus. There is a growing number of new listeners. To all of you, thank you so much for taking a chance on me and clicking that subscribe button. And to those listeners who've been here since the first episodes, thank you as well. It really brightens up my day to know you're out there and have taken the time to listen to this podcast. For those of you who've not subscribed, thank you also for taking time to listen to this episode. If you've made it this far, please consider following this podcast so you can join me on future rambles through the wilds of Jaff. Until next time, may your tea stay hot, your tropes well executed, and your Mr. Darcy tolerable, I suppose.